I spent months saving up for a luxury trip to Hawaii as a Christmas gift for my parents. But instead of gratitude, my mother threw it straight into the trash and said, "You're nothing. Even your gifts are worthless." That was the moment something inside me finally broke. For 29 years, I had done nothing but give. My two older brothers, Callum and Silas, had everything handed to them: college, cars, even their first homes, all paid for by our parents. Meanwhile, I was told I wasn't academic material and was expected to work straight out of high school to help support the family. Every paycheck I earned, every extra shift I took, was for them. I covered bills, repaired their cars, paid for emergencies. And yet, no matter how much I did, it was never enough. This Christmas, I thought things would be different. I worked 2 jobs, cut back on everything, just to give them something special: a week-long stay at a 5-star hotel in Hawaii. A gift that, for once, came from me, not out of obligation, but out of love. And what did I get in return? Disgust, dismissal, a reminder that in this family, I wasn't a son. I was a resource. I sat there in silence, swallowing the rage and heartbreak. But the next day, I made a decision that changed everything. And this is the real story of Zayden Whitaker, as shared on Reddit. A story of betrayal, resilience, and breaking free from toxic family ties. If you enjoy real-life stories like this, don't forget to support our channel, Reddit True Vault. Hit like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more shocking and emotional stories. I don't think my parents ever wanted 3 sons. They wanted 2 perfect heirs to carry on the Whitaker name, and 1 workhorse to keep the machine running. Guess which one I was? Growing up in the Whitaker household wasn't about love, it was about status. My parents, Everett and Lorraine Whitaker, weren't just proud, they were obsessed with appearances. Everything had to be polished, curated, picture perfect. Callum and Silas fit the mold effortlessly: tall, athletic, charming. The kind of sons they could show off at country club events and brag about to their friends. Then there was me. I wasn't a Whitaker. Not in their eyes. I wasn't tall enough, handsome enough, smart enough. I was too quiet, too awkward, too average. And if there was one thing my parents hated more than failure, it was mediocrity. When I was younger, I didn't understand why they treated me differently. Why my accomplishments were brushed aside, while Callum and Silas were celebrated like royalty. When Callum won his first tennis tournament, my mom threw him a party with catered food and custom decorations. When I got a perfect score on a math test, she barely looked up from her phone. When I was a kid, I still thought if I worked hard enough, they'd notice me, love me. I bent over backward trying to be what they wanted, but nothing I did was ever good enough. Not when they had Callum, the golden child, and Silas, the responsible one. I had no place in their world, and I learned that lesson early. The day I turned 14, my parents gave me a gift. It wasn't a cake. It wasn't a party. It was a list of bills. I still remember sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the paper in front of me. Household contributions, my mom called it. $200 a month. Because you live here, don't you? I was 14. I didn't even have a driver's license, but I suddenly had rent to pay. Of course, Callum and Silas never had to contribute a cent. They got to play sports, go to summer camp, take SAT prep courses. I stocked shelves at a gas station and handed over my paycheck at the end of every month. When I asked why I had to pay rent while they didn't, my dad sighed like he was disappointed in me. "Your brothers have bright futures ahead of them, Zayden. We have to invest where it matters." That was the first time I truly understood my place in the family. I wasn't a son. I was an investment. And a bad one at that. It only got worse as I got older. While Callum and Silas got full rides to college, tuition, housing, brand new cars, all covered by our parents, I was told that higher education wasn't for kids like me. "You're not academic material, Zayden," my dad told me one night when I asked about college. "We need to focus our resources on your brothers. It's just practical." Practical. That was the word they always used to justify throwing me away. It was more practical for me to get a full-time job right out of high school instead of wasting money on tuition. It was more practical for me to stay home and help pay the bills while Callum and Silas built their futures. So that's what I did. I worked. I paid. I covered the cost of everything that needed fixing. The new dishwasher when mom wanted an upgrade. The medical bills when dad's back went out. Callum's rent before he landed his big promotion. I gave, and they took. But no matter how much I did, no matter how many paychecks I handed over, I was still the disappointment. When Callum struggled in college, it was because engineering is a tough field. When I worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, I was aimless and lacked ambition. It was never fair, but I swallowed it down. because this was my family. And I kept telling myself that one day, they'd see how much I had sacrificed. That one day, they'd appreciate me. That day never came. And yet, despite everything, I still wanted to do something special for them that Christmas. Maybe I was an idiot. Maybe I just wanted to feel like I mattered for once. So I worked extra shifts, cut back on everything. And after months of saving, I bought them something I knew they'd love, a 5-star trip to Hawaii. It was the most expensive gift I had ever given anyone. The kind of luxury they always acted like they deserved. I presented it to them at Christmas dinner, expecting, hoping, for even a flicker of appreciation. My mom opened the envelope, glanced at the certificate, and without a second thought, threw it straight into the trash. That was the moment I finally understood. I had never been a son to them. I had been a tool, a wallet, a resource, and resources could be used up and discarded. So I sat there in silence, swallowing my rage, swallowing the heartbreak. But the next day, I made a decision that changed everything. I don't know why I thought that Christmas would be different. Maybe some part of me still clung to the fantasy that if I just tried hard enough, my parents would finally see me. Not as a failure, not as an obligation, not as their personal ATM, but as their son. So I worked harder than ever. I took on extra shifts at the shop, skipped meals, cut corners. Every dollar I made went into saving for something big, something that would finally prove, beyond a doubt, that I loved them, that I cared. I bought them a trip to Hawaii, not just any trip, a week-long stay at a 5-star resort. Oceanfront views, luxury dining, the whole package. It was the kind of thing they always dreamed about, but never bothered saving for themselves. Because, of course, they always had me to fall back on. I wanted them to see how much I had sacrificed for them, how much I had given. I wanted, just once, to hear thank you, but I should have known better. Christmas Eve, the whole family was gathered at my parents' house, just like every year. Callum and Silas were there with their girlfriends, dressed in designer sweaters, sipping wine like they were starring in some Hallmark movie. My mom had gone all out on decorations, white and gold everything, because she insisted that red and green looked cheap. I sat at the far end of the room, watching as my parents unwrapped expensive gifts from my brothers. A diamond bracelet from Callum, a high-end espresso machine from Silas. Each time, my mom gasped, eyes shining with delight. Then it was my turn. I handed her the envelope, heart pounding. She opened it, pulled out the certificate, and read the words printed in elegant gold lettering. A luxury vacation to Hawaii, 1 week at the Ocean Pearl Resort. For a moment, she just stared, and then, without a word, she tossed it straight into the trash. The room went dead silent. I heard the crinkle of wrapping paper, the soft clink of wine glasses. Someone cleared their throat. My mom smoothed her dress, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Mai chong laji ica. Nai ca kwa mai kung vio dung." I swear, for a second, I forgot how to breathe. I had spent months saving for that gift, months working myself to exhaustion, and she discarded it like it was nothing. I glanced at my dad. He just looked away. I turned to Callum and Silas, silently begging them to say something. Anything, but they just shifted in their seats, looking uncomfortable. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended me. Nobody cared. I sat there, frozen. My fingers dug into the armrests of my chair, nails pressing hard enough to hurt. I should have said something. Should have demanded to know why she would throw away something I worked so hard for. But what was the point? This wasn't new. This wasn't surprising. This was just another day in the Whitaker family. And I wasn't shocked. I was just tired. Because, deep down, I had always known this would happen. I had always known that no matter how much I gave, it would never be enough. I wasn't Callum. I wasn't Silas. I wasn't worth loving. So I sat there in silence, swallowing my rage, swallowing the heartbreak. And as my mother turned back to the glittering gifts from my brothers, I realized something. I was done. Tomorrow, everything would change. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of it all. The humiliation, the exhaustion, the sheer, aching loneliness. I had spent years bending over backward for them, working myself into the ground, handing over paycheck after paycheck, always hoping that maybe, just maybe, this time, they'd see me. But they never would. I wasn't their son. I was just a walking bank account. And for the first time in my life, I let myself accept that truth. I buried my face into my pillow, clenched my fists, and let the silent tears come. No sobbing. No noise. Because crying wouldn't change anything. Crying wouldn't make them love me. Crying wouldn't make them see me. But I knew what would. The next morning, I made a call. For the past 6 years, I had been making monthly payments on my parents' SUV. Not because I ever drove it. Not because I owed them anything. but because they had convinced me it was my responsibility as their son to help the family. They always framed it like that. Helping the family. It never mattered that Callum and Silas made more money than I did. It never mattered that they never paid for anything. It was always me. Well, not anymore. I called the bank and told them to cancel my automatic payments. And just like that, the illusion cracked. I wasn't their ATM anymore. For the first time in years, I felt something close to freedom. I went to work like normal, put in my hours, and came home. But this time, I didn't dread looking at my bank account. I didn't stress over what unexpected expense they would dump on me next. I kept waiting for the explosion. And sure enough, 1 week later, it came. It was a Tuesday evening when my phone started blowing up. First, a text from my mom. Mom, Zayden, the car is missing. Call the bank and fix this now. Not our car. Not Dad's car. Just the car. Like it had magically disappeared into thin air, instead of being repossessed because someone forgot that I was the one paying for it. I didn't respond. 10 minutes later, another text. Mom, are you serious? You know your father needs that car. He has doctor's appointments. He's stressed enough as it is. Oh, right. Like I hadn't been the one driving him to half those appointments myself. Then came the group chat. Callum, dude, just fix this. It's not that big of a deal. Silas, Mom is freaking out. You really think this was necessary? And then, the kicker. Mom, you are selfish and cruel. After everything we've done for you. I stared at that message for a long time. Everything they had done for me? Like what? That summer, I got my first job at a gas station. Not because I wanted to. Because my parents handed me a list of family contributions I was expected to make now that I had an income. $200 a month, Zayden. You live here, don't you? Meanwhile, Callum and Silas got to play sports, go to summer camp, take SAT prep courses. I spent my weekends wiping windshields and stocking shelves. One night, I came home late after covering someone else's shift. The house was dark, except for the glow of the living room TV. Dad was on the couch, sipping a beer. You're getting lazy, Zayden, he said, not even looking at me. I stood there, still smelling like gasoline and sweat. Callum and Silas study hard, he continued. They're going places. You just work at a gas station. I had never felt smaller in my life. Back to the present. Now, suddenly, I was the selfish one. I was the cruel one. I put my phone down and went back to work. Because unlike them, I had responsibilities I couldn't just dump on someone else. But I knew this wasn't over. That night, my father called. I stared at his name flashing on my screen. He never called me. Not unless he needed something. I let it ring twice before answering. Zayden, he said, voice tight. What is going on? I wiped my hands on a rag. Not sure what you mean. Your mother is hysterical. She had to take an Uber to the grocery store today. Do you know how embarrassing that was for her? I almost laughed. She could have used my old truck. Oh, wait. They told me to sell it to help cover Callum's tuition. Don't start with that, he snapped. Why did you stop the payments? I took a slow breath. Because it wasn't my car. And because I'm done being used. Silence. Then, quieter. You know, we always expected better from you. A part of me wanted to snap, to yell, to finally tell him exactly what I thought about the way they had treated me my entire life. But I didn't. I just smiled to myself and said, yeah, well, I expected better from you too. And then I hung up. For the first time in my life, I had drawn a line, and I wasn't going back. When I was 14, I got my first summer job at a local gas station. Not because I wanted to, because my parents decided it was time for me to pull my weight. I still remember coming home that first day, exhausted, my shirt reeking of gasoline, my hands stained with grease. I had spent hours in the blistering heat, stocking shelves, wiping windshields, and dealing with impatient customers. But despite the exhaustion, there was this flicker of excitement inside me. It was my first paycheck, my first real taste of independence. I walked through the front door, already thinking about what I'd buy, maybe some new clothes, maybe a video game I had been eyeing for months. But before I could even sit down, my mother spotted me from across the kitchen. She held out her hand. Not a word of congratulations. No, I'm proud of you, or even a smile. Just an open palm waiting for me to comply. I hesitated for half a second, just long enough for her expression to shift into irritation. My paycheck. That's what she wanted. Because, as she saw it, I lived in her house, I ate her food, and I used her electricity. That meant I owed her $200 a month. That was the number my dad threw out between sips of his beer, without even looking up. And just like that, my first real earnings, the money I had worked so hard for, weren't mine anymore. That was the first time they took from me, but it wouldn't be the last. Of course, Callum and Silas never had to contribute a single cent. They spent their summers at football camps, on beach trips with friends, in air-conditioned SAT prep courses that my parents happily paid for. Meanwhile, I spent mine covered in sweat and oil stains, handing over the majority of my paycheck so my mom could buy new kitchen appliances she didn't even need. And the worst part? I accepted it. I convinced myself that it was normal, that it was fair, that it was just the way things were. I told myself it was temporary, that once I turned 18, things would change. I would graduate, go to college, and finally build a life for myself. At least, that was the plan. Until I brought up the idea of applying for universities at the dinner table one night. Dad didn't even look up from his plate. College wasn't for everyone, he said. And by everyone, he meant me. Because, apparently, Callum and Silas had real potential, and it would be a waste of money to send me to school when I'd probably drop out anyway. That was the moment I understood. It had never been about money. It had never been about what was fair. They had just never believed in me. The next morning, my dad slid a job application across the table. It was for the auto repair shop down the street. He had already talked to the owner. I was lucky to have the opportunity. I looked at that paper and felt something inside me sink. But I took the job, because what else was I supposed to do? From that day forward, I became exactly what they had always expected me to be. A worker, a provider, a safety net. At 18, while Callum and Silas were getting acceptance letters from prestigious universities, I was working 12-hour shifts at the auto shop, coming home exhausted, only to be handed another bill that needed to be taken care of. When Mom wanted a new dishwasher, I paid for it. When Dad's truck broke down, I fixed it for free. When Callum struggled with rent before his big promotion, guess who stepped in? But no matter how much I did, it was never enough. Because at the end of the day, I wasn't their son. I was just their backup plan. Years passed, and I convinced myself that this was normal, that this was what family was supposed to be. I watched as Callum and Silas graduated, got high-paying jobs, bought brand new cars that my parents helped finance. Meanwhile, I was still living in the same house I had grown up in, still paying for groceries, still covering household expenses, still being told I should be grateful. Grateful that I had a roof over my head. Grateful that I had a job at all. Grateful that they still let me be part of the family. I buried every resentment, every frustration deep inside. Until Christmas. Until that damn gift. Until my mother looked me in the eye and said, Mai chan la gica. Nai ca qua qua mai kung vio dum. And suddenly, all those years of sacrifice, of exhaustion, of quiet obedience, it all felt like the biggest mistake of my life. And for the first time ever, I wondered what would happen if I just walked away. It started small, a few dollars missing here and there. I'd check my bank statements and see random charges I didn't remember making. $10 at a grocery store, $25 at a pharmacy. At first, I thought maybe I had just forgotten about them. I worked long shifts. I was tired. It was easy to overlook things. But then it happened again. $50 gone. Then 100, then 200. And by the time I realized what was happening, my mother had stolen $2,500 straight from my account. Not borrowed. Not asked. Just taken. Like it was her right. I confronted her the same night. She didn't deny it. Didn't even try to make up an excuse. It was for medical bills, she said, like that made it okay. Like that somehow justified stealing from me. As if I hadn't already spent my entire life paying for everything they needed. And when I told her she had no right, when I asked her why she didn't go to Callum or Silas for help instead, she scoffed. Your brothers have their own lives to worry about. I stared at her, stunned into silence. Because in that moment, I realized exactly what she meant. They had their own lives. But I didn't, because I had never been allowed to. I closed my bank account the next day, transferred everything into a new one, canceled every shared card, changed every password, and made sure my parents had absolutely no way to access my money ever again. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe. For the first time, they couldn't take from me anymore. But I should have known it wouldn't end there. Because my parents didn't just see me as their son. They saw me as their backup plan. And when one resource dried up, they would always find another. That resource, the house, the one they lived in, the one they had refinanced years ago under my name when they were drowning in debt. I had been 21 at the time. I barely understood what I was signing. All I knew was that they needed me to do it. That it was temporary. That they'd take over the payments as soon as they could. They never did. Because why would they? I was paying. I was handling it. And as long as I stayed, they never had to. So I made a decision. A final act of defiance. A way to take back every year, every cent, every piece of myself they had stolen. I put the house up for sale, filed the paperwork, signed the documents. And a week later, my parents got the eviction notice. The first call came from my mother. I didn't answer. The second came from my father. I ignored that too. By the third, the fourth, the 10th call, my voicemail was full of desperate, frantic messages. Zayden, what the hell are you doing? You can't do this to us. We have nowhere to go. I didn't respond because it wasn't my problem anymore. Then Callum called. Unlike my parents, he didn't beg, didn't scream. He just said, "You're really gonna do this?" And when I didn't answer, when I let the silence stretch, he laughed. Not because he thought it was funny, but because he didn't think I had it in me. "You're heartless, man." Heartless. That was the word he used. Not once in my life had he ever called me selfless. Not when I paid for his rent. Not when I covered bills he couldn't afford. Not when I gave up my own future so he and Silas could have theirs. But now that I was standing up for myself, now I was heartless. I almost laughed. Instead, I just said, "Figure it out." And then I hung up. It took 2 weeks for the sale to finalize. 2 weeks of silence. 2 weeks where no one called, no one texted. And then, one night, I got a single message from Silas. "Congrats. You won." Like this had been some kind of competition. Like I had done all of this just to spite them. But that was the thing, wasn't it? They had never once considered what they put me through. Never thought about the weight they had forced me to carry. Never even entertained the idea that maybe, just maybe, I didn't want to be their personal ATM anymore. My parents moved into a smaller house a few months later. Not because Callum and Silas suddenly grew a conscience, but because, for the first time in their lives, they had no other choice. They didn't step up because they cared. They stepped up because I was gone. Because I was no longer there to catch them when they fell. Because when it came down to it, the only reason they had never helped before was because they had never needed to. And somehow, that was the most painful realization of all. Selling the house didn't bring me joy. It didn't make up for the years I lost. It didn't erase the memories of every sacrifice, every moment I had been overlooked, every time I had been treated like I was disposable. But it did give me one thing: freedom. For the first time in my life, I was free. And no matter what they said, no matter how they tried to twist the story, I knew the truth. I wasn't the villain. I wasn't the bad guy. I was just someone who finally decided that enough was enough. I knew it would happen. I knew the second I cut them off, the second I walked away, my parents would have no choice but to turn to Callum and Silas, the two sons they had always praised, the ones who were supposedly so much more successful than me. But here's the thing. Callum and Silas had never been the ones to sacrifice. They had never been the ones to struggle. They had spent their entire lives taking. And the moment they were finally expected to give, they resisted it with everything they had. I didn't hear about it right away. By the time I learned what was going on, my parents had already been out of the house for months. They had fought the sale, of course, tried every guilt trip, every manipulation tactic they could think of. But at the end of the day, none of that mattered. The house wasn't theirs. It was mine. And once it was gone, they had no choice but to figure out their next move. Their first plan? Callum. He was the oldest, the responsible one. He made 6 figures working in finance. He had a 4-bedroom house in a gated community. Surely, he would help. Except, he didn't want to. Not really. He had his own expenses, he said. His mortgage, his investments, his car payments. He could help, of course, but not too much. Not so much that it inconvenienced him. And so, when my parents asked him to buy them a house, he lowballed them, offered to cover a small down payment if they agreed to find a place within a specific budget, as if they were bargaining at a flea market. They didn't like that, not one bit. They had been living in comfort their whole lives. They were used to having choices. And now, suddenly, they were being told to settle. They fought back, tried to negotiate, tried to get Callum to cover more, to give them something closer to what they were used to. But Callum stood his ground. So they turned to Silas, and it went exactly the same way. Silas, who had always been the golden child. Silas, who had spent his 20s traveling through Europe, living in high-rise apartments, buying luxury watches like they were nothing. He had never once struggled, because I had always been there to struggle for him. And now that it was his turn, now that he was being asked to step up, he was suddenly broke. "I have my own bills to pay. That's a lot of money to drop all at once. Maybe we can find something cheaper?" He even suggested that mom and dad rent instead of buy, as if they were some college kids looking for a short-term lease. It was pathetic, watching them try to negotiate, watching them squirm, trying to find any possible way to avoid doing what they should have done years ago. And the best part? My parents let them. They let Callum and Silas dictate the terms. They let them make the rules. Because unlike me, unlike the son they had always expected to sacrifice, Callum and Silas had boundaries. And my parents respected them. They never respected mine. Eventually, Callum and Silas caved. Just enough to shut them up. They bought them a house. A small one. Nothing special. Nothing like what they had before. But enough. Enough to keep them from being homeless. Enough to give them something. And for the first time in my life, I watched my parents accept less than what they wanted. Because for the first time, they had to. Because they no longer had a son who would give up everything just to keep them comfortable. When I found out, I didn't know how to feel. A part of me was satisfied because this was justice. This was the life they had always been terrified of, one where they couldn't just demand and receive. But another part of me, it was bitter because I had spent years giving them everything, and they had never once been grateful. But the moment they turned to Callum and Silas, the moment they had no other choice, they accepted whatever they could get because my brothers had never been expected to give, and that made all the difference. It wasn't about love. It wasn't about family. It was about control. And when I took that control away, when I forced them to rely on the only people they had ever truly cared about, they suddenly had to learn how to ask instead of demand. And guess what? It turns out, when they actually had to ask, they didn't get nearly as much because Callum and Silas were never better than me. They were just better at saying no. And if I had learned that lesson sooner, maybe my life would have turned out a whole lot different. I never realized how heavy the weight on my shoulders was until it was gone. I had spent so many years carrying my family, letting them dictate my life, bending over backward to keep them comfortable, until one day, I didn't. And just like that, I was free. The first thing I did after everything settled, I left, packed my bags, loaded up my car, and drove. I didn't know exactly where I was going at first. All I knew was that I needed to get away. Away from the expectations. Away from the guilt. Away from them. I ended up in a city a few hours away. Far enough to have distance, but close enough that I wouldn't feel completely lost. I found a small apartment. Nothing fancy, but mine. For the first time, I wasn't living in a house where I felt like an outsider. I wasn't walking through a front door that belonged to people who only valued me for what I could provide. This was mine. And damn, did that feel good. I got a new job, a better one that paid me what I was actually worth. And you know what? It turned out, when I didn't have to send half my paycheck to people who didn't appreciate it, I actually had money. Real money. Money to save. Money to spend. Money to do things I never let myself do before, because I was too busy making sure my parents didn't have to struggle. I took my first real vacation. Nothing extravagant, just a weekend trip to the mountains by myself. And for the first time, I understood what peace felt like. No guilt, no nagging phone calls, no sudden emergencies that I was expected to drop everything for. Just me, sitting on a quiet cabin porch, drinking coffee as the sun rose over the trees. And I thought, so this is what life can be. I started reconnecting with friends, too. People I had pulled away from over the years because I was always too busy, too tired, too drained from carrying burdens that weren't mine. And they welcomed me back without question. We went on road trips. We had late-night diner runs. We sat on rooftops, laughing over stupid things, watching the city lights flicker below us. And for the first time, I felt like I belonged. Not because I was needed, but because I was wanted. And my family, they were fine. Not thriving, but fine. They had their small house. They weren't struggling. They weren't suffering. They just weren't living in luxury anymore. And I didn't feel bad about it. Because the truth is, they were always going to be fine. They just never wanted to be fine without me. A few months ago, my mom tried to reach out. A simple text. Are you happy now? No apology. No acknowledgement of what she did. Just an attempt to reel me back in. I didn't respond. Not out of spite. Not out of anger. But because I no longer needed their validation. I was happy. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need them to know it. There was a time when I thought love had to be earned. That if I worked hard enough, gave enough, sacrificed enough, maybe they would finally see me. Finally appreciate me. But that's not how love works. Real love isn't something you have to convince people to give you. It isn't a prize you have to compete for. And if you find yourself in a situation where you're constantly trying to prove your worth, where you're only valued for what you can provide, then hear me now. You don't have to stay. You don't have to keep giving pieces of yourself to people who will never cherish them. You don't have to waste your life waiting for their approval. Build your own life. Find your own people. Because trust me, they're out there. This story is real. Zayden Whitaker shared his experience on Reddit, and we knew it needed to be told. If you want to hear more powerful, emotional stories like this, don't forget to support Reddit True Vault. Hit subscribe. Stay with us. And most importantly, choose yourself.